Well, if it isn't Aegis, then this is probably going to be the most controversial placement on the list. I am not about to have the fucking gall to say that it was easy to kick Akihiko out of my top 3 that tend to go into my final team, because it wasn't. It was really hard to make this call, but I do think by a small sliver, Akihiko generally ends up getting kicked out of my final team. But even then, for certain boss fights, he can occasionally end up getting swapped in to take the slot of our number 3 pick. For those of you who weren't aware, in the original Persona 3, Akihiko is already by far the most broken character in the game. No question, not even close. That's because in the original game, not only does he sport both a high magic stat and a high strength stat, meaning that he can put out high damage numbers with both physical and his lightning-based attacks, but he also runs a fucking monopoly on the game's debuffs. In the original, Akihiko learns every single major debuff in the game. Tarunda, Matarunda, Rakunda, Marakunda, Sukunda, and Masakunda. Meanwhile, everyone else, yeah, they get jack shit for debuffs. It's no wonder Aki's an auto-lock in the original, because when you combine all of this with his single target healing, he quite literally just does everything in one character, without really having any major weakness. All that said, back in the original game, most of the options you had were underpowered for party members, and now most of them have been buffed significantly. But of course, Aki was already the one character who was OP, so if anything, there's actually a bit of an argument to say that he's the only one who got nerfed in this mod. For one, Akihiko lost access to his Tarunda debuffs in this mod so that someone else could take them instead, and in its place, Aki learns Deikunda instead. Not bad of course, but clearly not as strong a move. As a result, Aki's stats have been reshuffled to have his DPS reduced by moving some of his strength and magic into his endurance instead. That being said, I think it'd be most fair to say that Akihiko did generally technically get buffed in this mod. It's just that he received by far a smaller buff than everyone else, allowing all the other party members to catch up. He may have lost Tarunda, but he now gains Debilitate later in the game, which combines Tarunda, Rakunda, and Sukunda all into one move. He also gets the brand new move, Gemini, combining both Marakunda and Masakunda together into one move. And it's one of the most deadly options in the game if you ask me when it comes to these new moves that package debuffs together. All that said, why does he tend to get cut from my final team if he's so good? Well, unfortunately, as boring of an answer as this is, damage does kinda matter. And the damage that Akihiko puts out in this mod with the reduced strength and magic stat just really does not compare that great to the competition. The only party member that he probably outperforms in terms of damage is Aegis. His physical damage doesn't necessarily keep up. He wields fist weapons, which have very high accuracy but low bash type damage. As well as that, late into the game, he learns the passive ability Fistmaster to make his basic auto-attack punches deal increased damage. And while this passive is nice to have, it actually replaces the only physical skill he ever learns, Sonic Punch, meaning that at the end game, he technically doesn't have a physical attack, which always felt very weird to me for someone who's supposed to be a boxer. His magic damage doesn't fare much better either, because as good as Maziodyne is, he never learns Elekkamp to amplify his electric damage, Mind Charge to, well, increase the damage of the move, or Thunder Rain, the actual rare, high-tier thunder-based attack that actually does massive damage. It also doesn't help that his element is electric, when Ken also uses electric attacks. And I already said that Ken was my pick for the team's main healer over Yukari, so that means you have to choose. Do you want to run a team with a poor coverage of the multiple different elements, or do you want to just not run Akihiko at all? That doesn't make him bad or anything, far from it. Akihiko is still a strong pick. I sometimes want to swap him in against a couple of the boss fights in the game when you're only dealing with one huge target you can easily spam Debilitate on. Element coverage doesn't matter all too much against bosses as well, who have no weaknesses. That being said, my final team was in desperate need of a heavier hitter to round everything out, and unfortunately Akihiko just really was not that.
Ta-da-da-da! I'm the man!
Sorry I couldn't get him to say Junpei has leveled up. I'm actually in disbelief that I couldn't find anyone uploading just an audio clip of that anywhere, and I'm not gonna lie, I couldn't be bothered to sit here for hours constantly leveling up Junpei until he said it, so that's the best you're gonna get. Anyway, back to the video. Well, this was a pleasant surprise. Generally, the popular opinion when it comes to the original Persona 3 seemed to me to be that Junpei is one of the worst party members in the game. I never see anyone using him past the early game. So much so, in fact, that despite watching multiple playthroughs of this game before, I only even learned the fact that his ultimate persona Trismegistus learns the Spring of Life passive to regenerate health every turn now that I've played the game myself. I thought this was part of the mod at first. Now, as to why Junpei tends to get kicked out of the party in most playthroughs of the vanilla game, I don't know what the exact reason is. Maybe it's because of his low crit chances, maybe it's because of his below average consistency when it comes to just landing his attacks, or maybe he just doesn't do that much damage in the original. Whatever it is, I can definitely say he is not a pushover in this mod, despite probably being the character with the fewest changes. Junpei seems at first to be the jack-of-all-trades character, being able to deal fire damage, all three kinds of physical, and some debuffs to boot. He uses two-handed swords as his weapons, which are very similar to Mitsuru's one-handed swords, but just with a slight lean towards more damage over less accuracy. His passive from his ultimate persona, Spring of Life, allows him to take quite a beating without breaking a sweat, and his damage output to begin with is fair, but not much to write home about. However, if Junpei really was this jack-of-all-trades, master of none that he seems to be at first, he would be nowhere near this high on the list, as I tend to find the characters that specialize in their respective purposes usually to be the most effective in games like this. No, Junpei's on this list because thanks to his enormous strength stat and some nice buffs to many of his physical moves, he is a physical damage powerhouse to rival the likes of Shinji while still being a jack of all trades otherwise once you hit the mid-game onwards. And when you combine that with power charge, his damage starts breaking into the quadruple digits. He's especially helped out by his Rakukaja being replaced in this mod with Tarunda and later Matarunda. And that means despite being such a damage-heavy character, who is also relatively tanky in his own right, and has access to highly damaging moves for the 4 different kinds of attack types, he also has the tools needed to defend the team when it's most needed. And this works out great for him. Usually on the kinds of turns that you would need to use Tarunda to survive anyway by reducing the amount of damage the enemies can do, you don't really want to be focusing on dealing damage yourself in the first place. You tend to be more concerned with basically just bracing for impact. So Tarunda is probably the most fitting debuff they could have given Junpei to use, taking up the turn of your main damage dealer on the turn you're trying to brace for a devastating attack, rather than maybe taking up the turn of your healer, which might have been a bad thing to deal with. On top of all of that, Junpei is the only party member in the game to learn High Counter. Now, if you've played Persona 4, you might be wondering why the hell I would care about High Counter. In Persona 4, High Counter is one of the worst skills in the game. It's just a passive that gives you a mere 20% chance of reflecting a physical attack. Or as it turns out, the whole reason it's so garbage in Persona 4 is because it got giga nerfed from its far more powerful state in Persona 3. For one, in Persona 4, physical is simply all bundled into one attack type, so it's easy to just get a persona with null physical if you're worried about physical attacks. Of course, in Persona 3 you have 3 types of physical to worry about instead, bash, slash, and pierce, and so it's a lot harder to get a persona who nulls all 3 of those. You know what's not hard though? Just getting High Counter, since it allows you to reflect all 3 kinds of physical. That being said, obviously a 20% chance wouldn't cut it, but that's the best part. In Persona 3 it wasn't a 20% chance. It was a 50% chance. Now, all that said, in fairness, High Counter is certainly a move that's more useful on Makoto himself than his teammates usually, but I think I've made the argument thoroughly enough by now for why Junpei is so great in this mod. He has earned the honor of being the main damage dealer for my final team, with his enormous damage output and his amazing self-sufficiency. Hell, even though his magic damage is certainly a lot lower than most of the other options in the game, I'm honestly sometimes even impressed by how much he can do, considering magic is definitely not his specialty. I know it's a bit late to be saying this, but what makes a good teammate in Persona 3? I think there are 3 main qualities that are very, very important. 1. High damage output. That one's kind of obvious. 2. Having access to relevant buffs and debuffs. I think you got that one so far. But the third one is very, very important and sometimes overlooked. They need to have the tools to prevent or recover from game-losing scenarios. Now, the obvious way this can be employed is obviously to have a main healer, but there's obviously many other ways you can try and prevent or recover from game-losing scenarios. And I think Koromaru covers basically every single way you can do that in one character, aside from just having healing. For one, his damage output. Now, I already mentioned that Junpei is my big pick for damage output, so I'm not going to pretend that Koromaru has the best damage output in the game, but that's certainly not to say that it's slacking, it's still very high. While neither his strength or magic stat are particularly high, they're both pretty average. That's because of course he has an extremely high agility, which we'll get back to later. He still learns the passive Fire Amp though, so he still has very high magic based damage despite his average magic stat. As well as that, he learns a fire move which is even stronger than Agidyne, which allows him to do even more magic based damage. But he is not at all reliant on magic, no. The main move that I use when it comes to damage dealing with Koromaru is his new move, Rend. This physical move at first might seem fine, but what's the big deal? It is a pretty hard-hitting slash-based physical attack, which seems to do pretty good damage, just not quite as much damage as some of the very best physical moves in the game. However, the reason why this physical move is so amazing is because it has a base crit chance of 35%. That might not sound that high, but it's a lot higher than you think. Most moves in this game that are physical moves that can crit only have like a crit chance somewhere between like 2% and 10%. I believe in Persona 4, the highest crit rate in the entire game you can get on a move at base is 25%. So having a 35% base chance crit rate on a move like this is extremely effective, especially because, well, I'm kind of giving the game away here, but there's only one person left on this list, so I doubt you'd be very shocked. The build that I'm going for here is a build that fishes for crits. I have moves that increase my chances of getting crits even more, and in combination with those moves, Koromaru ends up critting every other attack. Not only do those crits deal more damage, but of course they give you more turns and deny the enemy turns, or give you all-out attacks for mass almighty damage. So I think Koromaru has the damage side of things completely checked out. So what about access to relevant buffs? Well, in fairness, Koromaru only has access to one buff, however that one buff is more than enough, that being Masuku Kaja, granting the entire team an increased chance to dodge enemy attacks and an increased chance to not miss their own attacks. While this buff might be basic, it has always been one of the stronger buffs in the game, in my opinion only outshined by Mataru Kaja. Despite the fact it is only one buff though, it is a buff which is basically universally useful in all situations, whether it be offensive or defensively used, it works for both. It's also a buff which no other party member can learn, and so as a result, it's pretty important to have it. But lastly, having the tools to prevent or recover game-losing scenarios. I think this is the most important of the 3 points, and I think that Koromaru is amazing when it comes to this one. To start with, Koromaru does have a weakness, but not a relevant one. Koromaru is weak to light, but light and dark based attacks don't quite work the same way as other attacks in the game. For one, they are far more rare to see on enemies. I almost never see enemies that actually have access to hammer or Mudo skills. But on top of that, light and dark based attacks don't actually deal damage. Instead, they simply have a percentage chance to insta-kill when used on someone. And while that is scary, as a result, you do have the option of getting homunculuses, items which are consumed when you would have been insta-killed to save your life. Thanks to the existence of these homunculi, when you combine that with the fact that already light and dark based attacks are extremely rare to see on actual enemies, and I believe there's only even one boss in the entire game, the final boss, who even has light and dark based attacks, it means that it almost feels like you don't even have a weakness in the first place, even though you do technically still have one. So already, that's a pretty strong start. When you combine that with the fact that Koromaru also has the highest chance to evade attacks out of all party members in the game, being a dog, thanks to both his extremely high agility stat and the fact that he has his paws, which actually count as equipment. Instead of being able to put on footwear to increase his evasion, you can't put any footwear on him, but it doesn't matter, because in its place, he gets a base 125 point boost to his evasion, higher than any other equipment in the game could provide. Already, this alone is great. It makes Koromaru an absolute cockroach to the enemies that they can just never seem to kill. It's not like he's a pushover when he finally does get hit too, or that he's like a glass cannon or something. Don't get me wrong, it's not like he's a complete tank either, but usually he can withstand at least one pretty strong attack before dying. When you combine that with the fact that he seems to dodge like 2/3 of the attacks that come his way as long as you remember to cast Masuku Kaja, it means that Koromaru basically never dies. But the reason why this is important is because of the last piece of the puzzle, Fleetfoot, his brand new move. Eventually, Masuku Kaja gets upgraded to Fleetfoot, which not only casts Masuku Kaja, but also casts Ray Patra on every single member of your team. Ray Patra is a move that's used to get someone up who's been knocked down by an enemy. And so Fleetfoot will not only cast Masuku Kaja on everyone, but also instantly get everyone to stand up. This is important, since I mentioned in Persona 3, getting knocked down by an enemy not only means that the next attack that hits you will be undodgeable and that you'll take more damage, but more importantly also means that you'll spend a whole turn just trying to stand up without being able to use a move. Being able to save yourself in situations like that, game-losing situations where you enter a fight and the enemy just gets a lucky crit on most of your teammates. Koromaru is so useful for dodging those game-losing scenarios. I feel like the few times I was actually in danger of losing on my run through this game, usually what ended up happening is I go into a fight, the enemy goes first, and I just get an unlucky roll. They go for a pretty strong physical attack on everyone at once, and they usually land a few crits on people, or maybe they go for some other kind of attack and hit a bunch of people's weaknesses, and a bunch of people end up on the floor. And I'm like, oh god, by the time everyone stood up, it's probably going to be the enemy's turn again, I'm not going to be able to heal, and we're going to die here. And usually what ends up happening is Koromaru dodges the attack with his extremely high evasion and then instantly gets everyone standing up again with Fleetfoot so that we have the time to heal before the enemies can attack again. And thanks to Media Rahan, which again by the late game every healer will have to full heal the entire party, as long as your party isn't in danger of getting one shot, which realistically they won't be, that basically means you just averted death there. And it also means so long as Koromaru keeps dodging or at least surviving these hits without getting knocked down himself, you basically can't be killed. Not unless the enemy again can one-shot you somehow. Koromaru absolutely deserves the number 2 spot. However, it might make you think, well, who's number 1 then, if you hadn't already realized who it is? Behold. You may not like it, but this is what peak performance looks like. Let's start with the elephant in the room here. Ken's brand new move, Retribution, which later upgrades itself into Resolve. I consider Resolve to be the strongest new move added in this mod, and I fucking love it. Resolve is a Mataru Kaja, but one that comes bundled with the added bonus of also massively increasing the crit rate of all allies affected by it. Resolve is the entire reason I pivoted from using magic-based attacks for my main DPS like I did in Persona 4 to going all in on the physical build. I feel like there's a good chance people won't fully understand the gravity of why this move is so good, so let me try and explain. Knocking down enemies onto the ground and getting an extra move by exploiting enemy weaknesses is the bread and butter of the Persona games, right? Those extra moves and all-out attacks are insanely powerful, and they're supposed to be. So much so that you'll probably quickly notice that the vast majority of bosses in these games past the early game are usually weak to nothing. That's because exploiting weaknesses in Persona is so OP that come late game, it's almost impossible to make a boss fight with a weakness to exploit without it having that weakness turning that boss fight into an absolute joke you can mow over in 2 seconds. I mean, just look at the Emperor and Empress in this game, and they're early game bosses too. Now, criticals don't just increase your damage output, they also knock down enemies and give you extra turns. So do you see where I'm going with this? If the enemy has no weakness, but you still want extra turns to absolutely mow them over with, increasing your crit rate and using physical attacks with high crit chances is a near guaranteed way to still absolutely maul boss fights that you shouldn't be able to get through so easily with constant all-out attacks, no weaknesses necessary. Combine this skill with Koromaru's extremely high crit chances with his slash attacks and Junpei's Brave Blade, and you have some terrifying damage output at your disposal. I mean, at the end of the day, I don't know the numbers, but think of it this way. Let's say that with the critical chance buff, Koromaru only crits every 2 attacks and Junpei only crits, I don't know, every 3 attacks. Even still, you're getting basically an extra move every single time all your party members do one move. You know, if you do whatever you do on your main character, Ken has their turn and they use Resolve, and then Koromaru goes in with a slash and Junpei goes in with a Brave Blade. There's on average, high chance is that you're going to get an extra move out of one of those two people. And that's not even including you yourself if you're also using physical attacks. That is already huge, even if you just get one crit off of it. I mean, think about it this way. Would you like to have a move that's a Mataru Kaja that also gives you an extra move after you use it? Yeah, I would imagine you would. Extra moves are of course insanely broken to be able to get, especially in boss fights, and well, that's what this gives you. It might be chance-based, but it becomes less and less chance-based the more those chances go up, and the later you get into the game, getting more and more physical attacks with higher and higher chances to crit, to the point where eventually it just becomes statistically guaranteed eventually. You just might not get it literally every hit, but almost every turn you'll get at least one crit across your 4 party members. And to be honest, I think that really, if I wanted to, I could just leave it there. That alone is a justification enough for me to put Ken at number 1. I mean, ultimately, this whole strategy that everyone in my S tier uses is to go for exploiting crits, and the whole strategy lives and dies on resolve. If you take Ken out of the equation, then almost everyone in my S tier gets knocked down in power level severely. But hey, it'd be a little boring to skip over the rest of the reasons I think Ken is so good. So why don't I go over those two, even though I think in the grand scheme of things, they are nowhere near as important as just simply having the move resolve. There's of course the fact that Ken is one of your options for a main healer, and that does mean that he's capable of full healing the entire team anytime he wants by the end game, which is insanely powerful, as you could expect. Of course, Yukari can do this too, and in fact she can technically do it better because she also gets access to Amrita, a move that can remove all ailments from all allies. But ultimately, while Amrita is nice to have as a convenience, it's usually not all that important, and Ken has every single other healing move that Yukari does, so for the most part, Ken matches Yukari in healing output. He has semi-recalm just like Yukari as well to bring people back from the dead with full health. His stats are generally evenly balanced, but his highest stats are his magic and his agility, which are two very good stats to have high numbers in. Obviously, having a high magic stat not only increases his healing output, but also allows him to do more electric-based damage, and obviously having a higher agility means that he dodges more often and misses less often. And I think having high agility on your main healer, the main party member you're concerned about keeping alive, when you combine that with, of course, the fact you're going to be running Koromaru with Masuku Kaja, is a really nice combo to have. Ken also, like Koromaru, while he does technically have a weakness, that being darkness, again, darkness is the other kind of element which, having a weakness to it, doesn't really matter that much because of how ridiculously rare it is and the fact that you can counter that weakness with homunculuses. On top of all that, Ken's physical damage is no pushover either. Don't get me wrong, of course it's nothing all that impressive. I wouldn't expect it to be, his strength isn't very high, but it's a lot better than I thought it would be. I thought he'd kind of be like Yukari, again, low damage because, you know, not supposed to be a physical damage dealer. But actually, his spear attacks are quite useful. The spears in general are pretty good weapons in this game with high accuracy and decent damage. They also deal pierce type damage, which again, I think is the most valuable of the 3 types of physical damage. But on top of all that, Ken, by the end of the game, learns Primal Force, the strongest single target pierce type attack in this game except Pralaya, which even then, Pralaya is basically the same move, just with a slightly higher crit chance. So while clearly Ken isn't exactly putting out enormous damage numbers, not when you compare him to characters like Mitsuru or Junpei, he's still putting out respectable damage, both electric-based and physical-based, while also having access to light-based insta-kills with very high chances of working, especially now that he has Sanctify, a new move which has a 70% chance of insta-killing rather than 50 or 60%. All this just comes together to make a character that you just cannot remove from your team. Again, being a main healer, you need one. You're either taking Ken or Yukari, and with how many upsides Ken has, you're probably taking Ken. If you're taking Ken, then you have to be running a physical-based team, which is why Mitsuru kind of gets kicked down the list. And as a result, Junpei and Koromaru really get their chance to shine. Now, I do realize that there are a couple small problems with this final top 3. For one, you don't have many debuff options here, only Tarunda with Junpei, which is a bit of a shame. But usually you can cover those with your main character, and ultimately the only way that I could get a lot of debuffs is if I put Akihiko in here. But I think you can see the problem with that. Who does Akihiko replace? I can't have Akihiko replace Ken. Ken's locked in. He's our main healer and he's the thing that makes the whole strategy work. I can't really have him replace Koromaru either because Koromaru is the one with the highest chances to crit and is my most reliable backup for when things go south. That means the only person that Akihiko could really replace is potentially Junpei, but then I'd be losing my main damage dealer. And while Akihiko provides a lot of debuffs, he doesn't provide a lot of damage. Not to mention, he would not have great chances of critting considering he doesn't actually have a physical base move, he just has Fistmaster, the passive, and, well, his fists. The other downside with this team, which is clear to see, is that we have poor element coverage. Junpei deals fire-based damage, Koromaru also deals fire-based damage, and Ken deals lightning-based damage, which means that the main character ends up needing to cover for both ice and wind. Both of the types of damage there's only one party member in the game that they can cover. And don't get me wrong, that is a bit of a pain. However, you have to remember that in boss fights, element coverage doesn't usually matter, and boss fights are usually the hardest parts of the game. If you're using everyone on your team when you climb Tartarus and swapping between team members as they get tired, then I wouldn't recommend running all three of these at once, again, because of the poor element coverage, and because you also, in my opinion, don't want to use all of your best characters in the same team at once if you want to be trying to train up everyone. But again, when it comes to the actual boss fights and the actual tough parts of the game, I really think that this is the team to go with. I think the poor element coverage is a downside that you can live with, and I think that the poor debuff coverage is something you can compensate for with your persona choices as the main character. With all that said, thank you for watching. Let me know what your list looks like, and let me know what you think of the new Moon mod.